Hello, and thanks for listening to PXP Podcast. It's a show about leadership, self-development, personal growth, and accountability. I'm your host, Jayme. Now, you can catch our podcast on almost any platform or directly from our website at pxppodcast.com. To hear it hot off the press, check out our host on the Podbean app. If you have questions or want to hear a particular topic discussed, or even want to be a guest on the show, connect with me on social and send me a message. Now, are you ready to kick off today's episode? All right, here we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you may be in. Welcome to PXP. I'm your host, Jayme, and today we're going to peel back the layers on a fundamental yet often overlooked aspect of both professional and personal relationships. And it's an area that I am extremely passionate about, perhaps one of the most passionate areas that I research and practice in, and that is about setting clear expectations. You know, it's we'll call it the bedrock of what a successful relationship is built on, and whether that is, again, in the business space or in your personal life, whatever that looks like, that is, it's the foundation of that. And, arguably nowhere is that truer than in the employee-employer dynamic, right? And so, I'll just qualify this throughout the podcast. I may use the words leader or team member or employer, employee. Just know that I'm just speaking of that leader-team member relationship, that employee-employer relationship. Just know that I will use those words interchangeably, I'm sure. So it's been my experience that a significant majority of workplace challenges stem from unclear expectations, right? I think we could boil down to the vast majority of workplace challenges or difficulties, issues, if you will, that crop up to unclear expectations and issues with communication. I think those two by far occupy the vast majority of issues that we have to deal with in the workplace when it comes to this relationship, this employer-employee relationship. But today I want to dive in just a little bit to this idea of expectations. And it's a common scenario, right? An employer doesn't explicitly define a team member's role. Maybe their job description's not clearly defined. There's some ambiguity there. The standards that they're expected to meet, right? What is it that, what are we expecting of you, as an employee, here's what we expect, right? Or even going beyond that, but the consequences of falling short. Like what happens if we don't meet those expectations, because that matters too, right? There has to be an outcome for failing to meet the expectations. And then of course we have, I think which is probably the most problematic piece, is when we don't follow up when those expectations are not met. Now, that's not the root of the problem, but that is what perpetuates it, right? When we don't follow up when those expectations are not met. And I'll talk about how that affects the leader, and more so, I think, than the team member, but we'll talk about that. And so this lack of establishing these expectations, these boundaries, clearly defining them, it can sour the experience, right, for both parties. But again, I think it's the leader, that employer, who stands to lose the most, right? So what happens when expectations are clearly defined? So let's talk about like in an ideal space. So let's talk about what that looks like. Expectations are clearly defined, and they're communicated in a way where everybody understands it. There's a mutual understanding of what those expectations are. And I want you to think about closed loop communication. And this is where it gets a little challenging, right? Because it takes effort to ensure this is done. And sometimes we feel like I don't have time for this. I don't, because this oftentimes needs to be a very deliberate, sometimes even a one-on-one process between the leader and that team member. But it has to be a very deliberate process, because I want you to think about closed loop communication. In order to ensure that those expectations are understood by both parties, you have to have some closed loop communication. You got to know, if you're the employer, you got to know that that employee, that team member, understands what you're telling them. Both parties are on the same page, right? And both parties are on the same page regarding what happens when those expectations are not met. And the answer is pretty simple. Like, employees, they get, when those things line up, employees have these guardrails. They have some boundaries that they can function within. Oftentimes there's some autonomy within their job function. It may not be so rigid that, they have to follow step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and there's no variance, but maybe there's some autonomy in there, or even if they do have to follow steps, right? But they have some guardrails that they can operate within. And this clarity, it gives them the ability to perform their job functions with a little bit of variability, yet they are in this framework that's known and with expectations that are understood, right? So and on the flip side though, think about a situation where the employee fails to meet the standards that are expected by the employer, right? That team member doesn't live up to the expectations of that leader. Yet those expectations were never clearly defined, all right? So you have a team member who is not meeting expectations. However, those expectations were not clearly defined, which happens so much, right? I mean, if you're in an organization right now, you're thinking, yep, that happens in my organization. Why do I know that? Because it happens in all organizations. It's an area that every organization can improve upon, no matter how good they attack this, no matter how good they try to, define expectations. There's always area for improvement. Some organizations have a much greater opportunity for improvement than others. But who bears the brunt of that failure? So who bears the brunt when an employee fails to meet expectations, but those expectations were never clearly defined? In a negative culture type of an organization, that leader might say, well, that team member should have just known better. They should know, right? They ought to know better. And you could argue semantics. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but that's irrelevant. If those expectations were not clearly defined, that falls back on the leader. The employer, without a doubt, that falls back on them, right? It's a common misconception that employees should just know what's expected of them, but far more times than not, that is how the scenario plays out. But the truth is, whether they should or shouldn't, that's not on the employee, that's on the employer. The onus falls on the leader to ensure expectations are established from the outset. All right, if you don't listen to anything else that I say today, that one point is uber important for you to take away. The onus falls on the leader to ensure that expectations are established at the very beginning, all right, at the onset. When expectations are well-defined and an employee still falls short, so we'll combine these two scenarios. So expectations are well-defined, but an employee falls short. It sets the stage for, now we have the ability to put in a process that's aimed at improving performance, right? A performance improvement process, a PIP, or whatever you want to call it in your organization. But that process doesn't come as a surprise when expectations and consequences were clearly defined on the front end. And look, this approach, it isn't a one-size-fits-all. I get that, right? And it's a topic that we'll explore on future episodes, this idea of what to do after expectations aren't met. But this expectation setting, it's the cornerstone for the entire process. You have to clearly articulate what those expectations are. Let's dive into a real-world scenario that will illustrate the importance of setting these clear expectations. So imagine you have an employee, let's call him Jordan, and he's new to the organization. In this scenario, Jordan's employers, they have not clearly defined what the expectations are around, let's say, lunch hour. And as a result, Jordan assumes that it's flexible, and he begins taking a 15 or 20 minute extra lunch hour each day, right? So this small deviation, it actually disrupts the flow of work in this organization. So it starts to affect the team dynamics and timelines and things like that. Now, you might be quick to put the blame on Jordan for abusing the lunch hour rule, but I'll remind you that the crux of the issue lies with the employer. The failure to clearly define what the expectation of Jordan was from the outset has led to this situation. So without explicit guidelines understanding the lunch hour policy, Jordan operates under the assumption that his actions are acceptable, right? So there's a misalignment between the employer expectations and employee understanding. And this is such a classic example of pitfalls that arise from not setting clear expectations. So now let's flip the script. Let's imagine this scenario, but this time the employer did set clear expectations from the beginning. During Jordan's onboarding, the employer specifically states that the lunch hour is 1 hour, right? And emphasize the importance of adhering to that time frame and how it would affect workflow if that 1 hour time frame wasn't adhered to, right? So the expectation is communicated through, once again, like I said earlier, closed loop communication. So there was an understanding that Jordan knew and acknowledged what the policy was. And beyond that, the employer also outlined the consequences for not meeting that expectation, and that might have been a performance improvement plan or something like that. So there's this very clear mutual understanding between the two, right? And in this alternate scenario, if Jordan extends their lunch hour beyond the allotted time, the employer can now easily reference that initial agreement or that initial understanding that they had, and that clear expectations were agreed upon, and that the consequences for not meeting those expectations were understood, and they were straightforward, and now they can address the issue. So instead of it being a surprise, instead of it being a challenge for the employer, instead of it being this conflict that the employer has to deal with, now it's just a matter of, hey, you remember when we had that conversation about lunch hour and how important it was? Yes. And you remember we talked about what the consequences would be if we didn't follow the lunch hour rule? Yes. Okay. Well, now I'm just doing my job as an employer. I'm just following through on what we already agreed upon. So in that scenario, how can Jordan be upset? Because Jordan understood the rule, Jordan understood the consequences, and Jordan then chose to not follow the rule. Like, that's all on Jordan, right? And so this discussion around Jordan's performance and how he failed to adhere to company policy, it becomes a very constructive conversation that can now be focused on improvement and even further alignment, right? As opposed to, well, I didn't know. And you're playing this back and forth game about whether they did or didn't know the rule, or what, they didn't know what would happen if they violated the rule. All those things are off the table when there's clearly defined expectations, right? And not only does this prevent misunderstandings and, potential conflicts, but it also sets a precedent within the organization, right? So allowing employees to fall short of expectations without addressing it actually sets a new standard for everybody, right? So you've heard the saying that what you allow becomes the new standard. Well, what does that mean? It means if I allow Jordan to take an extra 10 minutes every day and I don't address it, well, then the 1 hour lunch policy is irrelevant, because now I have allowed a 1 hour and 10-minute lunch policy. And now what I'm doing is I'm effectively punishing those who are following the rules, right? Because Jordan is getting to take an hour and 10 minutes. Everyone else is trying to follow the rules, but I'm allowing an hour and 10 minutes, right? So I've set a new standard, and that's a lower standard that I've just allowed, right? It's essential to understand that what you allow becomes the new benchmark, right? And think about the fallout from that. How do your other employees feel? How do the other team members feel, right? You get resentment from your best employees because they're trying to adhere to the expectations. They're trying to contribute positively. They're trying to do what is expected of them, and they begin to feel undervalued. They get frustrated. They see other people not being held to the same standards. You know how that goes. And clearly defining expectations on the front end helps to alleviate a bulk of those challenges. I remember many years ago when I was a not brand new, but fairly new business owner, I had an employee that wasn't meeting expectations around being a team player. And I would hear about these issues, and they would occur when I wasn't in the office, and I would hear about them when I came back to the office, right? So when in my presence, though, the employee was a star. He was always hitting his sales numbers. He was always helping out in my presence. But when I wasn't there, that was a different story. And I didn't address the issue in a timely manner. And I grew more and more frustrated with him. His personality was strong, and he was, like I said, highly productive. But I continued to drag my feet. And eventually, I dreaded coming to the office because I knew this issue continued to loom over my head, right? I would come to work anxious, and I would go home frustrated. And look, I was the business owner, and I had an employee who was making me miserable, right? Have any of you ever felt that way? Where you have an employee who is starting to make your job miserable, and you own the company. It dawned on me one day while I was frustrated with the employee, no doubt, that I was actually mad at myself. This was a big turning point in my development as a leader. I was actually mad at myself. I was mad that I didn't set clear expectations on the front end. I was mad that I failed to address the issues as they came up. I was mad that I let it affect the rest of the team. I was mad that it caused me to become miserable, and it was bleeding over into every aspect of my life. And it was then that I realized I needed to level set with him and set clear expectations. I basically needed to start over, right, on the expectation conversation. And soon after doing that, I know you know where this is going, he worked himself out of the company. Like, he did not want to be held accountable. He didn't want to be in a role where he was held accountable to expectations. And I could have saved myself and my team a whole lot of heartache if I would have handled it correctly from the beginning by clearly setting expectations. And then if I would have acted in a timely manner when those issues began to arise. And I think I didn't set clear expectations from the beginning. One, I didn't realize the importance of it at the time. This has probably been 15, 20 years ago. I didn't realize the importance of it at the time. But he came with experience, and I just thought that he would know better, right? Sometimes we just give the employees, we give them this false benefit of doubt when we shouldn't do that. We should clearly define expectations. We should do it the same for everyone, right? In your organization, don't you want a culture of transparency and of trust and respect where every team member knows what's expected of them and then they can strive to meet those expectations? Of course you do. That's what we would all want, right? And if you're a team member, maybe you're not the business owner and you're listening to this. Maybe you're not a leader and you're listening to this. Isn't that what you want? Don't you want to know what's clearly expected of you? You want your responsibilities to be clearly defined, right? Because you want to do a good job for that employer. That's what we all want. We want to do a good job in the workplace. And so to do that, we have to have our expectations clearly defined. Otherwise, how do we know if we're doing a good job? How do we know if we're meeting expectations if those expectations have not been clearly defined? When we set clear expectations and we follow through on those with the consequences of not meeting those expectations, the organization then has the ability to maintain that high standard of performance, a high level of accountability within the team, and that benefits everyone. And believe it or not, that's what people want. People want equal, fair, consistent accountability across the board. I had the privilege of facilitating a tabletop discussion for a group of business owners recently, and the topic that I was facilitating was systems and processes. And there was a recurring question that kept coming up throughout this conversation. What do I do when my employees won't follow the processes? Okay, great. We've got system and processes installed in our company, or we're putting them in, or this, we know we need them. But even bigger than that, what happens when my employees won't follow those processes? And this question, at its very core, it revolves around this critical conversation of setting clear expectations. So how do we go about setting those clear expectations, right? This is PXP. We want to give you a playbook. We want to give you some actionable steps. So how do we do it? We've talked a lot about why it's important and what happens when we do and don't, but now let's talk about how to do it. It starts with open, honest, clear communication, right? You have to have a clearly defined role, or at least be headed in that direction, right? You can define expectations maybe without a clearly defined role, but having a clearly defined role certainly helps. And then the responsibilities of that person or that role in very unambiguous terms, right? Just make it clear as can be. And I get it. Some processes, some roles have a level of vagueness to them, and that's okay. But be as clear as you can, right? Something like an expectation of all team members in our organization is that they work together as a team, right? That's a fairly vague expectation, but it's also something that you can come back to, right? If two team members aren't working together as a team, if they continue to butt heads and they say, well, I'm not working with that person and I'm not working with that person, well, that's unacceptable, right? You've clearly defined the expectation is that we will work together as a team. And if two people say, I'm not working with that other person, well, then that's not meeting expectations, right? So while you want to define them as clearly as you can, expectation-wise, right, there are going to be times when some of them are going to be a little vague, but as much as you can, define them in unambiguous terms, right? Use closed-loop communication. We talked about this at the very beginning. It's super important to know that team member or that employee understands that expectation, because what you said may not have been received in the manner in which you meant it, right? So what you said has to be received in how you meant it, and we do that through closed loop communication. We have to make sure that person understands what those expectations are. So you might ask your employees to paraphrase what they've heard or repeat it back to you. Like, make sure that they understand what those expectations are. Handing them a employee manual, a company manual, and saying, read this, and then sign the acknowledgement page at the back saying that you've read this and you understand it, that's not closed loop communication, right? That's too unambiguous. We'd like to think that is sufficient, but it's not, right? You have to clearly define those expectations, and there has to be an understanding that both parties are on the same page. And then beyond that, you have to establish the consequences of what not meeting expectations looks like. And that's done on the front end. It's not done after they fail to meet expectations, right? So the expectation is that you are on time for work every day. And not meeting this expectation results in XYZ, whatever that is. Whatever your company policy says, whatever you decide the consequence for not meeting that expectation is, that should be understood by the employee, by the team member. It's just that simple, right? Setting these clear expectations, it's not a one and done thing, right? Sometimes we have to continually ensure that expectations are understood. It might be an ongoing process. It might require check-ins or even adjustments as necessary, right? You've heard of drift, and we've done a podcast on drift before. If you just search for drift in our podcasts, drift is the idea that something changes ever so slightly a little bit as time goes on. Maybe something changes 1 degree every day, and you don't notice the change because it's so subtle. But over the course of 6 months, you have gone in an opposite direction, right? And so you may have to continually reevaluate and make adjustments and have check-ins and remind people what the expectations are. If you see drift, then you may have to reevaluate this thing. So it not only ensures that there's constant alignment, right? But even bigger than that, it fosters this environment of trust and accountability. If your employees know what the expectations are and they know what the consequences are, and you are being consistent across the board, which is a whole nother conversation, but a massive piece of this puzzle, consistency, then there's trust and accountability that's fostered in that environment. So I mentioned at the very beginning we were going to talk about this from a business perspective, but this also crosses the line into personal life as well, right? How does this translate to personal relationships? The principles are very similar, right? Clear communication, mutual understanding, setting of boundaries, expectations. They're just as crucial in our personal lives, right? That's what creates a foundation of trust and respect. And those are essential components of any successful relationship, just like on the professional side, right? So these same concepts that we talk about now, it's the language is a little different when you're talking to your friend and you're trying to set expectations. You probably don't use the words mutually understood consequences, but the idea is the same, right? You want to establish expectations in a relationship, professional or personal. Well, that's about all the time that I've got for today. I went a little longer than I intended to, but this is a topic that I'm super passionate about, and it's such a big deal in the business world. I mean, it's such a big deal in business, in the workplace. I want to challenge you to reflect on your relationships in your professional and your personal lives. And I would ask you, are you setting clear expectations in your organization, whether you are the owner, whether you're a leader, whether you are a team member? Are there expectations being clearly defined in your organization? If not, why not? And what are you going to do to rectify it? There's an old saying that says, it's never too late to do the right thing, right? You could start clearly defining expectations right now. You could start today, and you'll have a better outcome moving forward, right? Are you fostering an environment where there is mutual understanding and respect? Is that your culture? Is that your household? Does that happen inside the walls of your house? Do you have mutual understanding? Is there respect inside the walls of your house? Sometimes we treat people who are the closest to us the worst, right? And some of that goes back to expectations. What we allow becomes the new standard. So remember, clear expectations are the foundation of success in any relationship. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I want to encourage you to share this podcast with somebody who might benefit from this discussion, whether that's a business owner, a leader, maybe a team member, maybe somebody who wants to become a leader, maybe just somebody that's on your mind as you think about this stuff. Let's help each other build stronger, more successful relationships, both professionally and personally. So if you enjoyed the podcast, share it with your circle, share it with the people that are closest to you. Probably, if you like the podcast, they will too. But most of all, I hope that something that was said today helps you to become a better version of yourself. I'm your host, Jayme Yarrow, and I hope you have an absolutely amazing day.